unless the big parties get serious about this issue of migration, unless they stop the boats, unless they lower legal migration, the politics that we saw in the 2010s, more polarized, more populist, that's just going to come back with a vengeance.
Less than a decade after the Brexit referendum, how would you feel about another one, potentially a controversial one? It's the proposal from a new report out this morning by the Legatum think tank. They say the only way that Rishi Sunak can now tempt reform voters back into the Tory fold would be a referendum on the issue of migration. Let's find out more. Matt Goodwin is Senior Advisor to the Legatum Institute and author of this report. He's also Professor of Politics at the University of Kent. Matt, good morning.
Good morning, Rosie.
Right, what would the question be? I think is the first thing I'm trying to understand.
Well, the first thing to say is this is the largest, most comprehensive survey of Reform Party voters that has been done. We got more than 3,400 people in this survey who are planning to vote Reform at the next election. And if you ask them why they're voting Reform, the top two issues for those voters, most of whom are ex-Conservative, firstly, stopping the small boats, and secondly, reducing the level of immigration in Britain. So not just small boats, also legal immigration. So what we've asked them is, look, given all of that, what would bring you back to the Conservatives? Because we know that if Rishi Sunak can't get this Reform Party vote down from 16% to like 2 or 3%, he's not really going to have a chance of pulling a rabbit out the hat at the next election. And 40% of those Reform Party voters say, look, if I get a big, bold offer on slashing immigration down from 700,000 to around 100,000, then I might be tempted to come back to the Conservatives. And that's the premise for this. I think, Rosie, the only way back here for Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives is to make a big, bold offer on the immigration issue.
Yeah, I think the challenge is we're not entirely sure what the Conservatives want to do when it comes to immigration. It feels as though migration is so baked into our economy that there would be significant immediate economic implications if we said, okay, right, from 700,000 we go to 100,000. I mean, that would cause chaos, wouldn't it?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say about the immigration regime that we've got is, firstly, it's not actually good for the economy. The Conservatives under Boris Johnson promised us lower immigration, but also high skill, high wage, highly selective immigration. What we've got is actually the opposite. We've got lots of low skill, low wage, non-selective immigration. You look at the last 2 or 3 years of migration into Britain. Here's one stat that I find mind-boggling. The share of all migrants coming into the country on high-skilled work visas is 15%, 1-5. Who are the rest? Students, the relatives of workers, the relatives of students, asylum seekers, illegal migrants. So the political economy point, Rosie, I just don't think is convincing anymore. And what Reform voters are saying is, look, it's, and this is a crucial point because I've talked to many cabinet ministers about this. They say, actually, if you want to bring these voters back, it's just about stopping the small boats. And they don't talk about legal migration, the overall levels of migration. What I'm saying to them now is, look, for Reform Party voters, it's not just about the Rwanda deal. It's not just about stopping the small boats. It's about lowering the overall rate of net migration. And the only way we can do that is by introducing a number of reforms, raising salary thresholds, cutting down on relatives, dependents, non-skilled workers, but also potentially going to the country and saying, can we have a serious conversation about what kind of migration do we want, and can we rebuild this economy, this low growth, high debt economy? Can we build it around genuinely high skill but lower immigration? And I think that's where Reform voters want to go.
Yeah, I think the reality is we are so reliant on immigration. We've been talking already this morning about what's happening in the health service, the NHS, the care sector. And, the wider picture here, with a declining birth rate, we're going to be even more reliant on immigration, not in a position where we can pull away from it.
Yeah, I mean, I'd sort of push back on that, Rosie. I think what we're doing is we're creating what academics now would call a population trap. Migrants get old too. And the problem that we've got here is that we are now we're experiencing such a scale and speed of population change that the capacity of the state to absorb that change, as we see in the NHS, as we see in schools, infrastructure, the housing crisis, the capacity of the state to absorb this scale of change is simply not there. So Canada is having a very similar debate at the moment in saying that, they're finally accepting that they've got the policy of mass migration wrong, and we've got it wrong too. And that's why, by the way, reform has been doing so well in the polls. 16%, it's winning over a third of 2019 Conservative Party voters. And to be frank, unless the big parties get serious about this issue of migration, unless they stop the boats, unless they lower legal migration, the politics that we saw in the 2010s, more polarized, more populist, that's just going to come back with a vengeance.
I mean, if we look at other polls in terms of YouGov's polling of what the public really want, it's things like better public services. It isn't kind of a whole scale transformation of our immigration policy. Someone's texted in to say, what would be the question? And I believe this is what your poll asked. It would be asking, would-be reform voters whether a national referendum on bringing down the rate of net migration from about 700,000 to less than 100,000 would make them more likely to vote Conservative at the next election. So that's kind of a question you've asked in theory. Can you ever imagine a situation where in practice we'd be asked to vote on a decision like that?
Well, I imagine in the 2000s we would have had a similar conversation with you asking me what would be the question for a referendum on EU membership. I mean, all things are on the table. What's underlying this offer of big, bold action on migration, reducing net migration levels dramatically, is reflecting public concern. I would just push back again on your point that people don't care about this issue. Immigration is the third top issue for all voters. It's the number one issue for Conservative voters. It's becoming more, not less important to voters as they become increasingly aware of what the Conservatives have done while they're in office. And if you look across Europe, the reason why Europe is going to move sharply to the right at the European elections in the spring, from Le Pen in France to Meloni in Italy to the Sweden Democrats and elsewhere, is because of these unresolved public concerns about migration.
Final thing, Matt, if the Rwanda plan literally got off the ground, would that shift the dial, do you think?
Well, my view would be we're not going to resolve the illegal migration crisis unless we have some form of deterrent in place. We're going to need a serious deterrent alongside increased monitoring in the channel. The basic point here, Rosie, is we've had 114,000 plus people enter Britain illegally since 2018, and the numbers so far this year are higher than any other year that we've had until now. And what percentage of those people have been removed from Britain? 1.3%. So this crisis, and it is a crisis, is costing us.
I think no one's denying that there's a problem with the process.
No, sure. But
right
I'm just putting this in numbers, just so people can understand. You want to fix a housing crisis, you want a better NHS, you want to see your GP. Well, we're spending £4 billion on our illegal migration crisis at the moment. So if we solve it, we've got £4 billion that we can throw at GPs, that we can throw at the NHS, and so on. So that's exactly why we've got reform on 16% in the national polls, and we've got a larger number of voters, by the way, giving up on politics altogether, saying they're not going to vote. And this is my real concern here. It's not actually about the Reform Party. My concern is we are simply going to go all the way back to the early 2010s or 2000s. We're going to have a much more disruptive politics. We're going to have more division. We're going to have more populism, unless we can actually address the grievances and the concerns that people have about how Britain is changing and the pace of change. Nobody's saying we're not going to have people working in the NHS from overseas. Nobody's saying we're not going to have any migration. But what they're saying clearly is they want net migration to be around 100,000, maybe 150,000 high-skilled doctors, nurses, people that can help the NHS. What they don't want is 700,000 net migrants per year, most of whom are not actually contributing to our high-skill economy. And I think that's the conversation we need to open up in the country. What kind of migration?
Which you certainly have done, opened up exactly that. Matt, thank you. Matt Goodwin, author of the research for the Legatum Institute. You can read a lot more about it inside the paper this morning. And, well, the texts are open if you want to have your say. Can you possibly imagine there being a referendum of that kind, a vote, a question that would not be then more divisive rather than less so?
Well, I think also what would be the question on the ballot paper, which you asked Matt Goodwin there, Rosie, it is still the crucial question. It's quite hard to know what it would be. But also a lot of people would say the Brexit referendum became almost a de facto referendum on immigration. It was one of the big issues there. And of course, we've had some very, very divisive referenda in recent years in Scotland, then the Brexit one. If you had one specifically on the issue of immigration, could be even more controversial. Morning to Ivor in London, who says immigration is ruining this country. It's already too late. How can we allow a town the size of Nottingham to arrive each year and expect our public services to work?